Picture Dubai at its peak, the Burj Khalifa catching the first light of morning, its reflection bleeding gold across the fountain below. Helicopters lifting tourists above a coastline that wasn't supposed to exist. Ski slopes inside shopping malls. Restaurants floating on the water. Hotels shaped like sails. A city that seemed to operate on the logic that if you imagined it loudly enough, it became real. For nearly 2 decades, Dubai was the answer to a question the world kept asking. What does ambition look like when it has no ceiling? Travelers came. Influencers came. Investment came. And so did the narrative that Dubai was not just a destination, but an event. A place you visited to feel the future. But something quieter has been happening underneath that skyline. Not a collapse. Not a crisis. Something more subtle, and in some ways, more telling. A slow reevaluation. A growing number of travelers returning home with a different feeling than they expected. A shift in how Dubai is being discussed. Not with the awe it once commanded, but with something closer to complicated. And when a destination built entirely on the power of its image begins to feel complicated, it's worth asking, is the edge still there? Dubai's success was never purely about geography or culture in the traditional sense. It was about engineering perception at scale. The city made global tourism feel like a luxury product. It sold not just experiences, but a version of yourself standing inside those experiences. The Instagram was built into the architecture. The spectacle was the point. And for a long time, that worked extraordinarily well. Dubai positioned itself as the crossroads of the world, between East and West, between old wealth and new ambition, between tradition and performance. Visitor numbers climbed year after year. The airport became one of the busiest in the world. Hotels multiplied. Neighborhoods were built on sand and ambition. But here is the tension that begins to emerge when you look more closely. When a destination's primary appeal is its image, it becomes permanently dependent on that image remaining aspirational. The moment travelers begin to arrive with expectations shaped by years of curated content and find the reality slightly more complicated than the content suggested, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way people talk about a place afterward, in the reviews, in the quiet conversations, in the growing number of travelers who came once and feel no particular pull to return. Let's begin with what many travelers notice first, and most politely leave unsaid. Dubai is expensive. Not in the way that great cities like Paris or Tokyo are expensive, where the cost carries a sense of cultural weight, of centuries layered into every street corner. Dubai is expensive in a way that can sometimes feel disconnected from what is actually being delivered. A dinner that costs what a week in Southeast Asia might cost. A hotel room priced at a premium not always reflected in the quality of the surrounding experience. Tour packages that bundle the spectacle efficiently but leave little room for the kind of spontaneous discovery that makes travel feel genuinely alive. For travelers with significant disposable income, this may barely register. But the broader tourist market is not made up exclusively of the ultra-wealthy, and increasingly, travelers are performing a mental calculation that Dubai, for all its engineering, cannot fully control. That calculation asks, for what this costs, what am I actually receiving? Not just the Burj, not just the fountain show, not just the desert safari that feels slightly more staged each time someone describes it, but the full experience, the texture of the city, the sense of genuine discovery, the feeling that you are somewhere rather than inside a production of somewhere. This is not a condemnation. It is a question of value perception. And value perception, once it begins to shift in enough conversations, starts to shape behavior before any data catches up. There is a particular kind of travel fatigue that has emerged globally in the last several years. Travelers, especially younger, more experience-driven travelers, have become increasingly sensitive to what might be called the authenticity gap, the distance between what a destination presents itself as and what it feels like to actually move through it. Dubai has always operated with a certain transparency about its constructed nature. It was never pretending to be ancient Rome or colonial Havana. It built itself on the logic of the new, the designed, the intentional. But what made that compelling in 2008 or 2012 is not automatically compelling in 2024. Because the world now has more options that offer genuine novelty without the sense of being inside a managed experience. Cities in the Middle East, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, even Muscat, are investing aggressively in their own tourism infrastructure. each offering a slightly different texture. Some travelers are beginning to find those alternatives more interesting, precisely because they feel less finished, less polished, less certain of what they are. There is something psychologically compelling about a destination that is still becoming. Dubai, by design, is always trying to signal that it has already arrived, and for a certain traveler, the very perfection of that signal is starting to feel like a limitation. For years, Dubai had a near monopoly on a very specific kind of luxury travel proposition in the region. That monopoly is softening. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 tourism expansion, with projects like Neom, Al Yala, and the Red Sea development, represents not just new inventory, but a fundamentally different narrative. Ancient civilizations, UNESCO heritage sites, an untouched coastline being open to international visitors for the first time. That is a compelling counteroffer. And it is not only coming from within the region. Southeast Asia continues to offer extraordinary value at a fraction of the cost, with a depth of cultural texture that no amount of construction can replicate. The Maldives remains dominant in the pure luxury resort category. European cities, despite their own overcrowding challenges, offer history and identity that runs deeper than any single skyline. What this competitive landscape reveals is a strategic vulnerability for Dubai that didn't exist at the same intensity a decade ago. Dubai built its edge on being incomparable, on operating in a category of its own. But categories, like markets, are never permanent. They shift when enough alternatives emerge that are compelling enough to offer travelers a genuine choice. The question is no longer whether travelers want to go to Dubai. Many still do, and many will continue to for years. The question is whether Dubai remains the first answer, the default choice, when someone with a flexible budget and a curiosity about the world begins planning. Beneath the economics and the aesthetics, there is a quieter concern that surfaces in certain conversations about Dubai. It is not loudly discussed. It does not dominate headlines. But it exists in the background of how some travelers, particularly Western travelers, relate to the city. The regulatory and social environment in Dubai operates under a different framework than most of its primary tourism source markets. Rules around public behavior, personal expression, and social norms that are perfectly ordinary within a different cultural context can create a low-level friction for visitors who are accustomed to a different kind of freedom in public space. This does not prevent people from visiting, but it can subtly shape who feels most drawn to return. The traveler who visits Dubai once may find it spectacular. The traveler who considers it as a lifestyle destination, for extended stays, for remote work, for repeat visits, may begin to weigh those frictions differently the second or third time around. This is not an argument about which system is correct. That is not the purpose of this analysis. It is simply an observation that the most durable tourism destinations are those where visitors feel not just impressed, but genuinely comfortable. And that comfort is a more complex thing than any skyline can fully resolve. Dubai's official tourism numbers have remained broadly strong. The city continues to attract tens of millions of visitors annually. It continues to rank among the world's most visited urban destinations. Hotel occupancy, airline traffic, retail spending. The macro indicators still tell a story of relevance. And that is precisely why this conversation is easy to dismiss from a distance. But headline numbers are not the only signal worth reading. Repeat visitation rates, average traveler satisfaction over multiple visits, the demographic profile of who is choosing Dubai versus who is choosing somewhere else. These are subtler data points that tell a more complicated story. A destination can remain popular in volume while quietly losing ground in desirability. It can continue to attract first-time visitors while struggling to convert them into the kind of loyal, high-frequency travelers that sustain a long-term tourism economy at its highest tier. Dubai's challenge, if it has one, is not visible from 30,000 feet. It is visible in the texture of individual decisions, in the shift of where aspirational travelers are pointing their attention, in the slow migration of the cultural conversation toward other places. That is not a number, but it may be the most important signal of all. Dubai is not failing. That is not the argument being made here, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you a simpler story than the truth deserves. What is happening, or what appears to be beginning to happen, is something more interesting than failure. It is the inevitable reckoning that comes for every destination that builds its entire identity on being extraordinary. Because extraordinary, over time, requires maintenance. It requires reinvention. It requires the willingness to acknowledge that the world your audience lives in has changed, and that your offer, must change with it. Dubai has reinvented itself before. That is, perhaps, its most underrated quality. The city was built by people who understood that ambition is not a destination, it is a practice. But the reinvention that may be required now is harder than building taller or filling more sand into the sea. It requires answering a question that has no architectural solution. What does Dubai feel like to someone who has already seen it? Because the travelers arriving for the first time will always be amazed. The Burj will always be tall. The fountain will always perform on schedule. The question is what the city offers the traveler who returns, not for the spectacle, but for something quieter, something more lasting, something that makes them choose Dubai not because it is impressive, but because it is irreplaceable. That is the edge worth watching. Not because Dubai is losing it, but because the world is finally asking whether it was ever fully there. And perhaps the most honest question any traveler can ask before booking a ticket is this: am I going to experience something? Or am I going to witness a very convincing performance of something? That distinction used to be easy to ignore. It is becoming harder.